The clinic's antiseptic smell had become as familiar as breathing after 3 years of patching up construction workers, treating diplomatic incident casualties, and serving as Haven Colony's bridge between human and Zephyrian medical needs. Dr. Jake Morrison cleaned his instruments with the methodical precision that came from treating patients whose alien physiology required careful attention to details that human medicine textbooks had never covered. Haven Colony existed because both species needed what the other could provide. Humans offered technological expertise and agricultural knowledge, while Zephyrians provided security services and mineral extraction capabilities that made frontier settlements viable. The arrangement worked efficiently, though actual friendship between species remained rare enough to be noteworthy when it occurred. Jake's clinic occupied neutral territory at the boundary between residential districts, its location chosen specifically to serve both communities without favoring either. The building's design reflected pragmatic compromise, human medical equipment housed within architecture that accommodated Zephyrian proportions and cultural preferences for angular, defensible spaces. Another successful day of preventing small problems from becoming diplomatic incidents, Jake muttered to himself while updating patient records that carefully documented treatment outcomes without editorial comment about the cultural tensions that created many of those injuries. The Zephyrians who sought his medical care typically did so with polite formality that maintained proper distance between species while acknowledging his professional competence. Their warrior culture emphasized self-reliance and stoic endurance, making them patients who rarely complained about pain and never questioned treatment recommendations. Jake had learned enough Zephyrian language and customs to provide respectful care, though he was careful to maintain professional boundaries that avoided complications arising from cultural misunderstandings. His reputation for treating Zephyrian patients with dignity rather than fear had earned him grudging acceptance in their community, though he remained fundamentally an outsider whose medical skills were tolerated rather than welcomed. The late afternoon brought the usual mix of human workers seeking treatment for industrial accidents and Zephyrian patients whose injuries reflected their culture's emphasis on physical conditioning and martial training. Jake treated torn muscles, minor fractures, and the occasional ceremonial scarification that required medical attention to prevent infection. Dr. Morrison called his assistant Maria Santos as she updated appointment schedules. "You have 3 more patients waiting, then we can close for the evening." Jake nodded while reviewing treatment notes for a Zephyrian construction supervisor whose shoulder injury had required careful manipulation to avoid exacerbating previous war wounds that were considered marks of honor rather than medical problems. The cultural complexity of medical practice in mixed communities required constant attention to nuances that went far beyond anatomy and pharmacology. Zephyrian concepts of pain, healing, and bodily autonomy operated according to warrior traditions that emphasized endurance and self-control, making treatment planning more complicated than purely human medical practice. "The next patient is human, Marcus Webb with a construction injury," Maria announced. "After that, we have 2 Zephyrian appointments for routine injury treatment." Jake completed his documentation while considering the evening schedule. Routine medical practice in Haven Colony had taught him to appreciate the complexity of providing healthcare in communities where species differences created both challenges and opportunities for professional growth. The construction worker's injury was straightforward, a deep laceration that required suturing and tetanus prophylaxis, followed by work modification recommendations that would prevent similar accidents. Jake's treatment was efficient and professional, though he noticed that human patients often seemed surprised by his calm competence when dealing with alien medical cases. "Doc, how do you stand working with those scaled warriors?" Webb asked while Jake applied wound dressing. "Most humans I know avoid the Zephyrian district entirely. Medical problems are medical problems regardless of species," Jake replied diplomatically. "Injured patients need treatment, not cultural commentary. Still, their customs are pretty intimidating. All that warrior honor stuff and formal speech patterns. Makes me nervous just thinking about trying to communicate with them." Jake finished the wound care while considering how to respond to cultural observations that reflected typical human attitudes toward their Zephyrian neighbors. Professional medical interaction focuses on health outcomes rather than cultural differences. Most patients appreciate respectful treatment regardless of their background. The conversation reflected attitudes that Jake encountered regularly. humans who viewed Zephyrians as alien and intimidating despite 3 years of successful coexistence. Such perspectives made his work more challenging, though they also highlighted the importance of maintaining medical services that served both communities equally. "That's probably the right approach," Webb acknowledged. "Though I still don't understand how you learn to communicate with them well enough to provide medical care." Professional necessity motivated language learning and cultural education. Effective treatment requires understanding patient perspectives, even when those perspectives differ from human approaches to health and healing. As Webb departed with care instructions and follow-up appointment scheduling, Jake prepared for his final patients of the day, routine Zephyrian appointments that would complete another successful day of cross-cultural medical practice that prevented small problems from becoming larger community tensions. Kirithel first appeared at Jake's clinic on a Tuesday morning with a scraped knee that she claimed resulted from training accident during cultural education. Her bronze-scaled skin carried the distinctive patterns that marked her as Zephyrian nobility, though her simple clothing suggested economic circumstances that didn't match her apparent bloodline status. "The injury requires cleaning and protective covering," Jake explained in careful Zephyrian while treating the minor wound. "Apply antiseptic solution twice daily until healing completes." The 10-year-old nodded with the formal politeness that Zephyrian children learned early, accepting treatment with stoic silence that impressed Jake despite his concern about the wound's appearance. The scrape looked more like deliberate abrasion than accidental injury, though he couldn't determine cause without asking questions that might violate cultural boundaries. "Payment for medical service," Kirithel said in accented Standard Galactic, producing small coins that appeared to represent careful saving rather than casual spending money. Jake accepted payment while noting that most Zephyrian families had medical accounts established through community cooperative systems. Individual cash payment suggested either family preference for privacy or circumstances that prevented normal medical access. Kirithel of the Sunset Clan, she provided when Jake requested identification for medical records. Age 10 cycles, residence in Honor District, guardian status with family patriarch. The formal introduction followed proper Zephyrian protocols, though Jake noticed that she avoided mentioning specific family members or dwelling location details that would normally accompany such presentations. 2 weeks later, Kirithel returned with bruised forearms that she explained as strength conditioning results from physical improvement training. Again, she paid with small coins and declined Jake's offer to contact her family about establishing proper medical account procedures. "The injuries suggest systematic impact rather than accidental trauma," Jake observed while applying cold compression therapy. "Perhaps training supervision could prevent similar damage." "Training methods follow traditional honor practices," Kirithel replied with the careful neutrality that suggested rehearsed responses rather than spontaneous explanation. "Physical conditioning requires endurance development that humans might not understand." Jake completed treatment while struggling with medical instincts that warned of systematic abuse disguised as cultural practice. Zephyrian warrior training involved physical hardship that built character and endurance, but the patterns he observed seemed excessive even within those cultural frameworks. The third visit, a month later, involved multiple small cuts on Kirithel's hands that she attributed to blade training accidents during weapon familiarization education. Jake treated the wounds while noting their defensive positioning, patterns typically associated with attempts to block incoming strikes rather than training mishaps. "Kirithel," he said carefully in Zephyrian, "medical examination suggests these injuries resulted from defensive reactions rather than training accidents. Such patterns often indicate need for protection rather than education." Her ears flattened against her skull in the expression of fear that transcended species differences, though she maintained formal composure while responding. "Human medical understanding cannot interpret Zephyrian cultural education practices. Training methods follow ancient traditions that build warrior strength. Ancient traditions should build strength without creating systematic injury patterns." Perhaps family discussion about training modification would improve educational outcomes. Discussion of family practices with outsiders violates honor codes that govern proper behavior. Training continues according to traditional requirements. Jake finished treatment while recognizing that his concerns were being dismissed through cultural explanations that discouraged further inquiry. Zephyrian customs around child discipline were largely unknown to human observers, and colonial protocols emphasized avoiding interference that could destabilize diplomatic relations. Over the following months, Kirithel's visits became routine, appearing every few weeks with injuries that ranged from minor bruises to defensive wounds that suggested ongoing trauma. Each visit followed identical patterns: formal politeness, cash payment, cultural explanations for injuries, and polite refusal of offers to contact family members about medical concerns. Dr. Morrison, Maria mentioned during one of their evening closings, that Zephyrian child has been coming here regularly for months. Do you think everything is alright at home? Her injuries are consistent with warrior training practices, though the frequency suggests either aggressive conditioning or inadequate supervision, Jake replied while reviewing Kirithel's file. Cultural differences make assessment difficult without better understanding of Zephyrian family structures. Still seems like a lot of accidents for someone so young. Zephyrian culture emphasizes physical conditioning that begins early in childhood. What appears excessive to human observation might represent normal educational practice within their community. Jake's professional explanation satisfied administrative requirements, though his medical instincts continued warning that systematic abuse was being disguised as cultural tradition. The challenge involved distinguishing between legitimate cultural practices and harmful behavior that deserved intervention. Have you considered contacting Zephyrian community leaders about the situation? Maria asked. Such contact would require evidence of actual abuse rather than cultural practices that differ from human approaches to child development. Medical ethics demand careful consideration before making accusations that could damage community relations. The ethical dilemma remained unresolved as Kirithel's visits continued with troubling regularity, each one adding to Jake's growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong despite cultural explanations that discouraged investigation. The evening that changed everything began with Kirithel arriving at the clinic just before closing time, her bronze scales reflecting the setting sun's light through windows that had witnessed months of increasingly troubling medical appointments. Jake looked up from his paperwork to see her standing in the doorway with injuries that clearly exceeded the training accidents she'd been reporting for half a year. Kirithel, he said carefully, noting defensive bruising along her arms and facial injuries that suggested direct assault rather than training mishaps. These wounds require immediate attention. She entered with the mechanical compliance that had characterized her previous visits, though Jake noticed trembling that hadn't been present during earlier appointments. Her usual stoic composure was cracking, revealing fear that transcended cultural conditioning about emotional display. Training intensity increased for seasonal warrior preparation, she explained while Jake examined bruises that showed clear finger marks around her upper arms. Physical conditioning requires enhanced difficulty to achieve proper developmental outcomes. Jake documented the injuries with clinical precision while his medical training screamed warnings about systematic abuse that was being presented as cultural practice. The bruising patterns were consistent with restraint and assault rather than any legitimate training methodology he could imagine. Kirithel, he said in Zephyrian, hoping that her native language might encourage more honest communication, these injury patterns suggest deliberate harm rather than educational conditioning. Medical evidence indicates need for protection rather than continued training. Her ears flattened completely against her skull, and for the first time in months of visits, her formal composure cracked enough to reveal genuine terror beneath the cultural politeness. Human medical understanding cannot interpret warrior training requirements, she whispered, though her voice carried desperation rather than conviction. Cultural education follows traditional methods that build strength through adversity. Traditional methods should not create systematic trauma that threatens physical welfare. These injuries indicate assault rather than training. Jake completed his examination while struggling with medical ethics that demanded intervention balanced against colonial protocols that discouraged cultural interference. The evidence clearly indicated abuse, but Zephyrian family structures operated under legal frameworks that limited human authority to intervene. Kirithel, I need to ask directly. Are these injuries the result of family violence rather than training accidents? The question hung in the air between them while she processed the implications of honest response versus continued cultural concealment. Her silence stretched long enough for Jake to understand that his suspicions were correct, though she remained trapped by circumstances that prevented acknowledgement. Family honor requires privacy about internal educational practices, she said finally, though tears were beginning to form despite Zephyrian cultural constraints against emotional display. Outsider intervention violates traditional authority structures that govern proper child development. Medical intervention protects patient welfare regardless of cultural considerations. If you're being harmed, professional ethics require appropriate response. Response from human authorities creates diplomatic complications that affect entire community relationships. Individual problems must not threaten colonial cooperation agreements. Jake realized that Kirathel understood the political implications of her situation with sophistication that reflected months of adult conversations about why her abuse couldn't be reported through normal channels. Someone had explained that her suffering was acceptable collateral damage for maintaining human-Zephyrian diplomatic relations. Kirathel, medical ethics prioritize patient welfare over diplomatic considerations. If you're being hurt, that takes precedence over community politics. But intervention requires proof that human authorities will accept as legitimate rather than cultural misunderstanding. Zephyrian family practices often appear problematic to human observation even when they follow traditional requirements. The conversation revealed the impossible position she occupied. Trapped between abuse that was being disguised as cultural practice and political systems that prioritized diplomatic stability over individual welfare. What would constitute proof that human authorities couldn't dismiss as cultural misunderstanding? Jake asked. Direct observation of behavior that violates both human and Zephyrian standards for acceptable family interaction, she replied with the clinical precision of someone who'd been forced to analyze her own victimization. Evidence that transcends cultural interpretation to demonstrate universal harm. Jake felt his heart breaking as he understood that a 10-year-old child had been forced to become expert in legal technicalities that might justify intervention in her own abuse case. Kirathel, are you asking me to witness something that would provide such evidence? She looked directly into his eyes for the first time in months of medical appointments, her expression carrying desperation that transcended species differences. Dr. Morrison, if I asked you to follow me home tonight, would you come? The request violated every protocol about professional boundaries and cultural interference, but Jake recognized it as a desperate child's last attempt to find protection from systematic abuse that everyone else had agreed to ignore for political convenience. Yes, he said without hesitation. If you need my help, I'll come. The knock on Jake's clinic door came at 2,347 hours, barely audible above the ambient sounds of Haven Colony's night cycle. He opened it to find Kirathel standing in the darkness, tears streaming down her bronze-scaled face as she struggled to speak through sobs that shattered her usual cultural composure. Please, she whispered in broken standard Galactic mixed with desperate Zephyrian phrases, follow me home. Please, Dr. Morrison, you must see. Her terror was absolute, overriding months of careful emotional control as she grabbed his hand with the desperation of someone whose last hope was standing in front of her. Jake grabbed his medical kit and followed her into the narrow streets of the Zephyrian residential district without asking questions that might delay whatever intervention she needed. Kirathel led him through winding paths between traditional dwellings built in the angular architectural style that reflected Zephyrian defensive preferences. Her home was modest but well-maintained, indistinguishable from neighboring houses except for the sounds of violent confrontation that echoed through walls not designed to contain domestic disputes. Inside, she whispered, pointing toward windows that revealed shadows moving with the rhythm of systematic brutality. You must see what happens when father returns from military duty. Through the transparent aluminum windows, Jake witnessed a scene that shattered his understanding of Kirathel's situation entirely. A large Zephyrian male, clearly her father based on physical resemblance, was beating a smaller female with methodical violence while two younger children cowered behind furniture that offered inadequate protection. The reality hit Jake like physical blow. Kirathel's injuries hadn't resulted from child abuse. They were defensive wounds acquired while trying to protect her mother and siblings from domestic violence that Zephyrian cultural codes prevented her from reporting to authorities. She tries to shield the little ones, Kirathel explained through tears, but father's military training makes resistance impossible. I get hurt when I attempt intervention, but medical treatment for children raises fewer questions than medical treatment for adult females. Jake watched in horror as the systematic brutality continued, understanding that Kirithel had been seeking his help for months without being able to explain the true nature of her family's crisis. Her visits to his clinic weren't about her own abuse, they were desperate attempts to document violence that she couldn't report through normal channels. "Why can't your mother seek help directly?" Jake asked, already activating his emergency communication system to contact both human colonial security and Zephyrian community leaders. Zephyrian family honor codes prohibit female family members from revealing internal conflicts to outsider authorities. Cultural privacy laws protect family autonomy from external interference, even when that autonomy enables systematic violence. And your father's military position makes internal community intervention impossible. Officer status provides social protection that discourages community leaders from investigating domestic behavior. Military honor traditions assume that warrior discipline creates proper family structure rather than enabling abuse. Jake contacted Colonial Security Chief Martinez while maintaining visual surveillance of the ongoing violence. "Chief, I need immediate emergency response at Zephyrian Residential Address 47C, domestic violence situation requiring immediate intervention under Universal Welfare Protocols. Dr. Morrison, intervention in Zephyrian family matters requires authorization from their community leadership. I can't respond to domestic disputes that fall under alien cultural jurisdiction. Chief, I'm witnessing systematic assault that violates both human and Zephyrian standards for acceptable behavior. This transcends cultural interpretation, it's criminal violence that demands immediate response." Through his communication system, Jake could hear Martinez consulting with supervisors about jurisdiction and protocol while violence continued in the dwelling before them. The bureaucratic delay highlighted exactly the systematic problems that had trapped Kirithel's family in ongoing abuse. "Dr. Morrison," Kirithel said quietly, "I brought you here because you treat Zephyrian patients with respect rather than fear. You are the only human I have observed who sees us as people rather than alien threats to be managed through diplomatic protocols." Jake realized that his months of professional medical care had earned trust that Kirithel was now using to save her family from violence that everyone else had agreed to ignore for political convenience. "Kirithel, why did you think I could help when your own community leaders couldn't?" "Because you have observed our injuries for months and asked careful questions about their causes. You suspected truth that others were trained to ignore, and your medical authority provides credibility that might force acknowledgement of what everyone pretends not to see." Colonial Security arrived simultaneously with Zephyrian community leader Velfarin, their joint response creating the multi-jurisdictional authority necessary to intervene in domestic violence that had been hidden behind cultural privacy norms. "The situation requires immediate medical assessment and family protection services," Jake announced as the response team assembled. Systematic domestic violence has been ongoing for months, with evidence documented through repeated medical treatment of defensive injuries sustained by child attempting to protect other family members. The intervention that followed involved complex coordination between human and Zephyrian authorities, but the visual evidence of ongoing violence made denial impossible. Kirithel's father was removed from the dwelling and charged under both human and Zephyrian legal codes, while her mother and siblings received immediate medical care and protective services. "Dr. Morrison," Kirithel said as emergency responders completed their work, "I chose to trust you because you saw our pain and asked questions about its causes. That combination of observation and concern convinced me that you might help when traditional authority structures had failed." 6 months later, Jake continued providing medical care for Kirithel's family while they rebuilt their lives with support from domestic violence services that now operated across cultural boundaries. The intervention had created precedents for protecting vulnerable family members regardless of species or cultural privacy considerations. "You saved us," Kirithel told him during a routine follow-up appointment, "not because you understood our culture, but because you understood our humanity." Jake realized that the most important medical lesson he'd learned had nothing to do with alien physiology or cross-cultural communication, it was recognizing that suffering transcended species differences, and that sometimes the most professional thing a doctor could do was follow a desperate child home to witness the truth she couldn't otherwise reveal.